Kenya Brumfield Young is a professor at St. Louis University in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. And she has accepted my invitation to moderate this panel today. So Kenya, go ahead and take over, and then we'll do some question and answer at the end.
Great, thank you. And again, welcome to all of you. I appreciate you coming. If you have not muted, if you're not speaking, would you please mute so we're not picking up background noise? I would greatly appreciate it, and it would also make it a lot easier for everyone else to hear. Jay Shepard, hi Jay, say hi. Jay is a 27-year-old Black, queer, non-binary, messy work in progress who is passionate about the liberation, the healing of all Black people, twerking and staying hydrated. Jay is the abolitionist organizer at Action St. Louis, and Jay dreams about the abolition of police, prisons, and a world where Black people are thriving and not just surviving. Say hi, Jay.
Hey, y'all. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great, thank you. Next is Professor Richard Rosenfeld, and he's the Curator's Distinguished Professor Emeritus in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. His research focuses on crime trends and criminal justice policy. Dr. Rosenfeld is a fellow and past president of the American Society of Criminology. Hi, Dr. Rosenfeld.
Hi, Kenya. Good to see you.
And you as well, thank you. And last we have John Chasnoff with the Coalition Against Police Crimes and Repression. And John is a longtime activist on police and criminal justice issues, having worked on issues regarding police misconduct, local control of police, civilian review, and abuses in city jails. For 26 years, John ran his own St. Louis house painting business. Subsequently, he worked for the ACLU of Eastern Missouri. Additionally, he's been a member of the Coalition Against Police Crimes and Repression since 1999. He's currently the co-chair of that organization. He's also part of the Ferguson Collaborative, working for People's Voices in the Ferguson consent decree process, an active member of Privacy Watch, which organizes against mass surveillance. He is a graduate of Yale University. Hi, John.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here.
Welcome. I thank you all for joining us today in this reimagining public safety conversation and what it means to defund the police. There's a lot of different narratives and understandings and misunderstandings about what all this means and from various perspectives. So what we've asked is for you all to come today and to just discuss your perspective, your thoughts, and then we'll have some Q&A and we'll further those discussions. So would you mind, Dr. Rosenfeld, would you prefer professor or doctor? You're muted. You're still muted.
How about just Rick? I'm fine with that.
Okay, perfect. Rick, since you have to leave the earliest, I'm going to start with you. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Great.
So I come at the issue of police reform out of kind of two starting points. One is a genuine commitment, interest in and commitment to reforming policing so that police misconduct is reduced and unwarranted police violence is reduced. The other, though, is a commitment to reducing violence overall. As many of the folks who are viewing or listening in today know, in both St. Louis and Kansas City, we've seen significant spikes in violence, homicide, gun violence, overall serious assault over the summer. And that, for me, is quite worrisome. I've written reports on it. And so I want to begin my brief remarks on police reform by suggesting that police reform should proceed in a way that facilitates effective responses to the spike in violence in our communities. Even without the spike in violence, violence is far too high in both St. Louis and Kansas City. So what kind of police reform would facilitate effective responses to violence? For me, it goes without saying that policing has two core functions, and that is to prevent, and if prevention fails, to address serious crime, both violent and serious property crime. Anything that detracts from those core functions, as far as I'm concerned, is on the chopping block. And so let me suggest, and clearly this is not original, but I want to focus my attention on police reform to those activities that have fallen to the police by default or to which we've assigned police responsibility that really shouldn't be police responsibility. Two that come immediately to mind are responding to drug emergencies and responding to day-to-day problems of the homeless. The police spend a good amount of time in these activities, as well as other activities that have little or nothing to do with addressing serious crime. And the more time the police devote to these other activities, for which they'll be the first to admit they're not fully prepared, they're not adequately trained, others can do it better, the more time they devote to those activities, the less time and attention they can spend on addressing their core functions, which is to prevent and address serious crime. Other agencies, other sorts of personnel are much better equipped, better trained to deal, for example, with drug overdoses. The fire department has been in the emergency medical services business now for decades. The fire department is far better trained, far better equipped to deal with drug overdose and other drug-related emergencies than the police department is. Social service agencies are much better able to deal with problems of the homeless. They do already, although calls tend to come to the police department. We don't need police officers responding to every single call for issues having to do with the homeless population. What we don't know, however, is what fraction of those calls having to do with homeless issues really might require police presence because of the potential for violence. If someone on this panel or someone viewing knows that fraction, I'd love to hear it. But what we need, I think, both in that area and in the area of responding to drug emergencies, what we need is experimentation to happen that should start happening tomorrow. We need to know the fraction of cases involving problems with the homeless, for example, that really would require a police officer being present. I suspect that fraction is relatively low. We don't know for sure. We can find out by designating a particular area and the calls emanating from that area and finding out how many of those calls actually would require police presence. So let me wind up by simply saying there are functions that the police currently perform that are important functions, to be sure, but not functions that involve the core mission of policing. So those functions should be outsourced to more appropriate agencies and personnel as soon as possible, leaving the police better able to attend to serious violence. Will that mean we can reduce police budgets as a consequence? I don't know. I mentioned that experimentation is necessary. We'll find out what the price tag is for policing that is leaner, that is devoted to its core functions. That price tag may be lower than the current police budget. We don't know that yet. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Kenya.
Thank you very much, Rick. I appreciate that. And I'm sure that there will be plenty of questions for you. So I'm glad we have you at least until 1.
Great.
Jay, please, your thoughts.
For sure. Like was said, my name is Jay. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I primarily work on abolitionist campaigns as an abolitionist organizer. So that means campaigns that seek to divest from carceral systems like policing and jails and invest in community initiatives. Yeah, I personally think that the police can't be reformed. I don't know how you reform a system that is trained to use violence and enemy in every case and will do so and is sanctioned by the state to do so. We at Action are calling for the defunding of the police, right? And defunding the police is this process of reallocating funds and responsibilities from police departments to community-based systems of safety, prevention, de-escalation. So it's stripping away funds from these systems that are murdering Black folks and putting funds into community initiatives that are promoting the health and healing of Black communities, right? So it's defunding the police is this demand to reduce the size, the budget, the power of all institutions that surveil, police, punish, incarcerate, and kill Black people to zero, and investing in building entirely new community infrastructures that will produce genuine safety and sustainability for our community. I know that's pretty wide, that's a lot, but it's really this rally cry to get rid of all systems that oppress and kill and incarcerate Black people and invest in community transformative practices. We know that the police, little of, as what Richard had said, little of what the police deal with is actually about solving and preventing crime. The police don't come and provide preventative measures. They come after a crime has been committed, right? So they don't actually work to prevent crime at all. And I think it's about looking at where we see police right now, our schools, sometimes grocery stores, patrolling homeless folks, and getting rid of systems, of getting rid of the police in those areas, getting rid of the police departments in those areas, getting rid of the militarization of the police and all of these military weapons that they use on peaceful protesters, for example. Finding areas within the budget right now. I know one area we've been talking about at Action is that there's budgeted for 800, well, there's 800 positions right now, a little over 800 positions for police officers in St. Louis. And the budget has over 1,000 positions in positions that aren't even being used would save us $9 million that we can invest into actually preventing crime, because the root cause of crime is poverty, right? So if we're not going to address that, then we're just going to continuing these arrest and incarcerate models that are harmful for Black communities. Yeah, I want to throw in the chat this chart I like to use for really thinking about reformist reforms and abolitionist steps to policing. But really, like, I'm not interested in giving the police more body cameras or really inflating their budgets. And really, they don't be giving police body cameras or banning chokeholds or, you know, these reforms that have still led to the murder of Black folks. Eric Garner, for example, chokeholds were banned and he still was murdered, right? Also, the courts don't really hold police accountable for anything. So I'm gonna put that in the chat though. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jay, and we will be coming back to you, that's for sure. John, welcome. And your thoughts, please.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Christine asked me to kind of take a broad view of police budgets and talk a little bit about history of policing, police budgets, and how we got to where we are today. Kind of lay a foundation for this question of, you know, should we defund our police budgets too high? Is policing serving a function that's productive or not productive in our society? And so I'm going to take a few minutes to go back and talk about police budgets, past, present, and future. maybe help lay a groundwork for sorting out this discussion. And I think there's two main themes that keep popping up when you take that broader historical view. The first one is the question of personal responsibility versus societal responsibility. So does crime happen because of personal character flaws, or does crime happen because society is set up in a way that we produce criminals by our socioeconomic system, which forces people into illegal behavior? I think that's one of the big questions. And the other one is, to what extent can we use technology and things like police professionalization and improved technique to solve our social and economic problems? And I'm going to focus mostly on that second question because it is most relevant to police budgets. But if you go way back in the history of policing, in the early days, the main method that we had for policing was the cop on the beat. And so most of that was the primary expense, was the payroll for hiring officers. But along the way, we have had an increasing reliance on technology and moving away from, kind of that personal interaction between a cop and the community, and more towards technological solutions. And as we've done that, police budgets have gone up, and the proportion of the budget that goes towards technology has been increasing. And there has been this belief that better technology will help solve our problems. So for instance, in the very early days, we had the telegraph, which greatly increased the ability to communicate and police to communicate with each other and respond more rapidly to situations. That you probably all have a picture in your mind of the call box where the officer, way before cell phones, he could go to this box on the street and ring up headquarters, and communication was greatly improved. We had things like police wagons for transport, which were really crucial for getting teams of officers to suppress labor revolts that were happening and greatly changed the nature and the ability of police to respond to protest type situations. We had in the early 20th century the advent of fingerprinting, and oddly enough, the Dewey Decimal System, with people associate with libraries, but was an important way for police to start to categorize folks and keep records on folks. It was an early form of surveillance, and most folks don't know that J. Edgar Hoover actually started as a librarian and helped bring the Dewey Decimal System into policing in the United States. So we had then we had, later on the advent of police cars and police radios, which really changed policing from that cop on the beat to more responding to calls and better communication through radio systems. So those are kind of some of, increasing technology that came and changed police budgets along the way. Not that there wasn't still a huge amount of money going towards personnel, but more and more money going towards technology. But there was a big ramping up of that technological push in the late 60s and the early 70s. The idea was that, we needed, better living through chemistry type approach. We can solve our social problems if police kind of catch up with the and change in technology. One of the influences on that was that as Vietnam was starting to wind down, the defense contractors needed places to places to sell their wares, but the police departments were scattered around the country, and we had a decentralized policing system. It was hard for them to sell to police. So the federal government stepped in and started taking on a bigger and bigger role in police budgets. They passed some national laws that allows defense contractors to sell wares to the government, and then the government would pass them on to individuals. So, and coming back from Vietnam, we had new technologies that were developed overseas, like video systems, helicopters, computers were coming into fore, and so more of our budget started going into more and more technology. and policing became more and more federalized, and those budgets got more and more federalized. And that was really the beginning of what I would call a military-industrial policing complex. We talk a lot about military-industrial complex, but policing was really put, a part of that complex of selling wares and materials and increased technology, increased budgets for technology. So then coming up to what I'm going to call the present era, which, broadly defined, I'm going to say is 21st century. We had 9/11 happen and a major shift in policing around 9/11, where we moved away from what had been a kind of push for community-oriented policing, community policing, to what was called intelligence-led policing. And intelligence-led policing was very popular, in the post 9/11 years, but that concept really merged with another phenomenon that happened, which was the Great Recession of 2008. And so during that recession, municipal budgets were under a lot of stress, and it was harder and harder for police to continue to increase their budgets because municipalities were under stress. And so they began to rely more and more on surveillance as a way of replacing officers on the street. So I was just on a call last night where they were talking about this system in Baltimore where they fly planes over the city and cover huge amounts of the city. And they said, these planes could replace more than 100 officers on the street. The idea was, more efficiency, better, quote unquote, better use of our finances. And so we also had a push in the 20th century. Again, just like we saw after Vietnam, new technologies developed there. We saw new technologies develop in Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan that have been brought home and employed in policing. So, for instance, we have an intelligence center in St. Louis that they now call the Real-Time Crime Center, but originally it was the Real-Time Intelligence Center, which was a technique and a phrase that was developed overseas in the wars. And so we have, as proportions of police budgets, we have less money now going towards personnel and more money going to things like surveillance, the Real-Time Intelligence Center, drones, or this, what they call persistent surveillance system. They're talking about bringing that to St. Louis now, flying planes over the city that continually surveil the city. And these are very expensive programs. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to install video cameras on the streets and set up the infrastructure for the Real-Time Intelligence Center. And so more of our money is going to that in that direction. And then especially since Michael Brown, policing has become less popular as a profession, less status as a profession. And it's becoming harder and harder for police departments to recruit. And that's a problem all over the region. Regardless of residency rules, there just aren't many people now wanting to go into policing, and all the police departments are short. So they're putting more and more money into technology. I think now that we are at a really crucial turning point, there are really two main forces happening in terms of policing budgets, and one of those is the movement that Jay is a part of, and CAPCAR as well, defunding the police. So there's a strong push to look at this question of public safety and come up with the answers that really most of our problems are not due to individual responsibility so much as they're due to socioeconomic forces that push people into crime. And so we would be better off putting more money into education, housing, healthcare, the things that are the root drivers of crime, rather than this system that's based on personal responsibility theoretically, which is a arrest and incarcerate model. So that is one strong push. But there is a push in the other direction of greater and greater technology, more and more surveillance, controlling the population that way. And I think the dilemma for that approach is that we have tried it now for decade after decade, and the expenses have only gone up, not only in police budgets, but we had a mass incarceration system that got to the point where our jails were bursting over with so many folks. And the whole 3 strikes and you're out approach was seen as a failure. Even Republicans or conservatives are calling it a failure because we simply can't afford to build more and more prisons. But there is a push then to solve our problems through more technology, more surveillance. And we're really at a turning point, I think, in decision-making as a culture. Are we going to move towards defunding the police and finding alternative ways of looking at public safety? Or are we going to go in this direction of more and more control through greater technology? So I'll stop there.
Thank you, John. Very much appreciated. You all have amazing perspectives. They're very diverse, they're very broad, and I really appreciate those. I'm going to actually start off with some questions. I was reading in, I don't know if you all have read the book, Bleeding Out by Thomas Abbott, and it discusses some of the things that we actually have discussed here, is that the socioeconomic issues as it pertains to violence and policing is very integral. Those are the roots of the issues that can sometimes take, from 4 to 8 years to properly address, in terms of starting non-for-profits, getting the collaboratives together, and those types of issues. Whereas we still have this immediate crisis of the, as he puts it, the issue that needs to be triaged, which is the immediate violence in the communities and things like that. So under a model such as a defunding model, as you're addressing the long-term issues of the poverty and the socioeconomic issue, because also in the book he discusses how violence also helps to perpetuate long-term poverty, excuse me. How would a model such as defunding the police, how would that also address the immediate issue of the violence that's occurring now? How does it triage the current violence in those underserved communities?
And I don't mind jumping in on that one, because Kapkar has thought about that one and tried to, and is still trying to come up with the answer to that particular question, because we got that a lot as we were doing a campaign of re-envisioning public safety and thinking of alternatives to policing. That's fine that we take this long-term approach of education, but that takes a long time when we have an immediate problem. Our answer to that was the Cure Violence program, which we fought very hard to bring to St. Louis City. And that's a public health approach rather than a criminal justice approach to violence. They intervene and mediate situations in the community, try to de-escalate situations before they result in gun violence. And they have historically shown a pretty rapid drop in violence that they're able to affect through this public health approach. So we were interested in bringing that to St. Louis precisely because it could be an immediate answer to that question, while we also employ the things that take a longer time to show results. Unfortunately, the program hasn't been particularly well administered by the city, and there are frustrations on how Cure Violence is currently going. But at least theoretically, and in many other places around the country and around the world, it has been able to show a rapid reduction through alternatives to policing.
Okay, thank you, John. Rick.
Yeah, John and I have had long discussions about Cure Violence. I read the research record a little bit differently than John. There are some notable successes associated with the Cure Violence approach, but the success rate isn't 100. The literature is somewhat mixed. And so the other thing about Cure Violence, even if it were administered well, and I quite agree with John, it has not been administered effectively in St. Louis, at least so far. it's a very, very limited instrument to affect citywide reductions in violent crime. As of now, the Cure Violence effort in St. Louis, which I should remind folks, was funded to the tune of, several $1 million, taxpayer dollars. The program is operating in 3, John, correct me, or is it now fully 4 communities? 3. 3 of our communities have the program, and that cost anywhere from $5 to $7 million. So it's an enormously expensive approach with a track record that is, I would say, mixed. There's nothing wrong with the approach in principle, but I have real questions about its effectiveness to bring us relief from violent crime in the immediate term. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Rick.
Just quickly answer that, it was $7 million funded for Cure Violence. That's over a 3-year period. So we're talking about, a little over $2 million a year, as opposed to a police budget that is, what is it now? $208 million a year, and which has not shown itself to be effective in stopping these high rates of violence in our community. So, I think if we can invest more in Cure Violence as if it's able to show success. And I think that if it does show success as an alternative policing, it really sets the groundwork for realizing that we need to pull money from that $208 million. And that's where we'll find the money to finance both Cure Violence and then the housing and education and healthcare needs that we need to fill.
Do you know offhand which communities were chosen for the Cure Violence?
Yes, the Wells Goodfellow area, the Walnut Park, and Dutchtown.
Thank you. Jay, please.
Yeah, I think that right now, what we have doesn't work, right? Like, if police and jails work, then we would be the safest place ever, right? So what we have right now isn't working. The police aren't doing anything really to prevent violent crime at all. And so I think that one thing that's been beautiful out of this mess of COVID is like we've found ways to take care of each other. Communities are already doing this work to take care of each other. And it calls for this vision of a city where all of us have someone we know and we can call when we need help. I think about mutual aids that have been set up right now to really take care of folks' immediate needs in this time. One thing I've been looking at more is pod mapping. So figuring out like who, and I'll throw a resource, just like a worksheet in the chat of pod mapping. So figuring out who in your community you can call when you have an immediate issue. I think for most Black communities, we already don't call the police. Like policing is, we already know that it's gonna make situations worse and not keep us safe. But like having those relationships with each other, it would call us to really transform the way we do community now, really transform the way that we interact and engage with each other. Yeah.
Jay, Jane, just one moment. Jay, for those who are unfamiliar, could you just give a brief overview of pod mapping so that those who are unfamiliar are familiar with the concept? And then we'll go to Jane.
Yeah, so your pod is made up of people that you would call on if violence, harm, or abuse is happening to you. Or the people that you would call on if you want to support in taking accountability for violence, harm, and abuse that's been done. So you would like have 2 different pods potentially, or the same pod for folks you call for harm, and then folks that you are taking accountability with and going through an accountability process with. Or also a pod if you've witnessed violence, or if someone you care about was being violent or being abusive. So it calls you to, and like one of the I threw in the chat this activity created by, I believe it's Mia Mingus, who works with the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. And you put in the center yourself and then bubbles of like different, like who's in my community. Maybe it's your church community, maybe that extends who's in that community, to really create those pods.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Jane VanSant, we had a question. Jane lit up a minute ago, so I thought Jane had a question. No?
No.
Okay, great. Thank you. Kathy asks, do you need to create this pod? Do people help you create this pod? How is this pod created?
Yeah, you would need to create your own pod because you know who those folks are. You know who those folks that you would call if violence, harm, and abuse is happening. Or like you would have to think those through, or maybe even think through, and maybe that's not folks that you actually do know. Maybe that's different resources in the community, right? That could be nonprofits. It doesn't have to be individuals, but yeah, you would create your own pod.
Okay, and a comment that we have, it says, police don't prevent crime. They're supposed to solve crimes or catch perpetrators, but they don't prevent anything. Prevention has everything to do with opportunities, education, stability. So actually that leads to my next question, because we were just discussing, oh, go ahead, Rick, please.
No, can you go to your next question? I mean, I have a response to that one, but I'd like to hear your question too, if it's related.
Well, it was loosely related. I'd actually rather you go first, and then I will join after you.
I want to respectfully take issue with the idea that the police don't prevent crime. I quite agree that by and large, the police have a relatively limited contribution to make to overall crime reduction, because that's precisely because crime is a function of underlying socioeconomic conditions. But the police can play a role, and that role can include prevention. We did a study some years ago in which we asked police officers to elevate patrols in areas that had recently had spikes in violence or where violent crime was heavily concentrated. And we randomly allocated those areas to a treatment group, if you will, where the police elevated their patrols, and a control group where, policing remained as usual. And what we found was where police presence was heightened, we saw a reduction in serious assaults. So that when there are more police around, it does tend to reduce crime. Now, we were very concerned about the possibility with additional police presence, there would be additional occasions for police misconduct. So we looked at complaints during the period that the experiment was carried out. There were complaints, but they tended to come from low crime, largely white communities in the city, complaining that police officers were not as present in their neighborhoods as they had been because they'd been redeployed in larger numbers to these higher crime neighborhoods. We saw no increase in complaints on the part of the communities that were subject to elevated policing. I don't want to defend the police from charges of misconduct. All I'm suggesting is that it is possible for the police to play a limited role in preventing crime, not just responding to crime.
And if I could amplify on that for a sec, I basically agree with Rick on that one, that there is a prevention aspect to policing. When it was the cop on the beat, that was one of the original ideas, was that cop's presence in the community would actually prevent crime. And when we moved to police cars and started to rely more heavily on this model of response to calls for service, some of that preventative function of policing disappeared. But I would also say this. This was something I learned when I worked at the ACLU on school to prison pipeline. You know, if you have a school system that doesn't deal with the underlying causes of why kids are disruptive at school, then you can do whatever. You can put them in suspension, you can send them to police, put them in juvenile detention, discipline them the way you want. But as long as the system is not functioning properly, there's always going to be a new kid who is going to be the disruptive one at school. And so the idea that you can somehow or other stop crime from happening without dealing with those underlying causes, I think is fundamentally flawed. There will always be new folks who feel, for whatever reason, forced into a lifestyle that is based on what our society has decided is illegal. And so, yes, I think there is some preventative role police can play, but it's not the most effective way of getting to the source of our problems.
Jay, would you like an opportunity to respond?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what John just said. That it's not getting to the root of why crime is happening. And when we get to the root, we have healthier, safer communities, right? So having heightened police presence, and I would also I think that it's interesting that those privileged communities don't have as heightened police presence, right? And have lower crime, right? I think that those communities already have abolition at play, right? And they're already not being super patrolled and super over criminalized and surveilled. But when we get to the root, when we get to the fact that we spend $208 million on policing and zero on homelessness in our budget, and we get to the root of homelessness and education, then we don't have this need.
So thank you, Jay. I appreciate that. Or did I cut you off? I'm trying to read where you are. I'm sorry. Please.
No, I was getting distracted by something.
Okay, please continue. There's just this long pause, and usually when that happens, it's my cue to go. So no, okay. Please continue. Okay. The commenter said to thank you all for your perspectives. So in that same, so we've acknowledged that there's still there is a need to meet pressing violence needs, and that this current model isn't moving or isn't addressing things as is, and that is an immediate struggle. In terms of public understanding, there is this. We all have a need to feel safe, and safe is relative, and I think it's very relative, but feeling safe is safe. How do we educate the community that if, defunding means to, we're training social workers to either work with the force, or we're shifting focus altogether and developing more non-for-profit agencies to be in the community, whichever shape this model takes, because there's several different ideology it's around what this is. And I think that's part of why a lot of people are unsettled by it, is that how do we convince people that even with a major shift in even safety reform, that they're still safe, or that we're making people safe, or that we're addressing needs that mental health needs that need to be addressed, or socioeconomic needs that need to be addressed, that there's going to be a reduction and hence an increase in safety. How do we educate and get people to and have people understand those perspectives? Rick?
Yeah, well, I would go back to something I said earlier, which is I don't think there's much dispute that if you ask people what are the core functions the police should be performing, they will say preventing and addressing serious crime, right? And if so, to your question of how can people be persuaded to embrace this type of policing reform, I would simply remind people that right now the police do not spend most of their time engaged in their core functions. And they could be spending more time if some of the activities the police engage in, which they fully admit they're not prepared to deal with effectively, were transferred to agencies better able to meet those problems. That would include, by the way, the fire department. You know, the fire department is sort of the elephant in the room that nobody discusses. It also takes a major bite out of our public safety budget. And the fire departments across the country have been very, very successful in reducing fires, right? And that's why they got into the emergency medical services business some decades ago. The fire department is quite capable of assisting the police or taking over functions from the police. I mentioned responding to drug emergencies. That's certainly one. But another would be routine traffic functions. It's not ever been clear to me why fire personnel could not be used for routine traffic functions to relieve police of some of those burdens. So let's not forget, we have another set of frontline public safety officers. They are our firefighters, and they should be considered as an alternative to the use of police officers for performing some of the functions we currently assign exclusively to the police.
Thank you. John, Jay, either one of you?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that question. How do we convince people and make sure that people feel safe? You know, there has been a lot of backlash against the defund message. I just followed a thread on STL today where folks were freaking out. That's the most ridiculous idea. You know, we have no police. Then, you know, there will be chaos on the streets. I think that the dynamic is that activists tend to be, you know, our creators, our imaginers, our dreamers, and set goals and then work as organizers to push the community towards certain goals, you know, and there's always a push and pull. If you introduce an idea too soon, the community is not educated about it and don't know how to react or just freak out like they have in this situation. At the same time, you have to like kind of be ahead of the curve and pull people along and imagine the next step. You know, when Jay and others started talking about closing the workhouse, that seemed like such a far-fetched idea, but when we wanted to create a civilian oversight board, that was an impossible dream. And those things are, you know, come into reality or about to because the community education process happened. I think it's incumbent upon us to realize that we don't have all the answers. As dreamers, we can picture a goal and see how we can get there. But Angela Davis said something that was very influential to me. She said about abolishing prisons. We don't know how to abolish prisons, but we know how to take the next step to get closer to where we can figure out how to abolish prisons. So I think it's a process, and we need to do the push and pull of being ahead of the community, but also pulling the community along, educating, taking the next steps that make the steps beyond those imaginable. And we're in that push and pull right now.
Thank you, John. Jay?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time on my work with Close the Workhouse, knocking on North City residents and asking folks what makes them feel safe. And overwhelmingly, it wasn't police and jails. Overwhelmingly, it was access to education, healthcare, housing, resources, right? Because you feel safe when you have a roof over your head and you can pay your bills, and like I know that I can go to the doctor and like be seen. So yeah, I think that one, it's surveying community about what is safety to them, and then putting those things into practice, right? So if you feel safe, um, having health insurance and having um, quality education, we work towards seeing where can we take from the budget right now that spends way too much on arresting and incarcerating folks, and put that into making sure our folks have health insurance, making sure our folks have food, have basic resources to feel safe, right?
Have to run. I know, Rick, I know you have to run. There's one question for you. Do you have time for it?
I do.
Okay, great. One of our panelists, one of our guests is asking about qualified immunity in regards to policing, and stating that there will always be a distrust in the community as long as that exists. How does that fit into a reform model or a defund the policing model, or is it something you might advocate keeping, or do we revisit that? What does that look like to you?
I think it's an important component of kind of the portfolio of recommendations that come out of have come from the protests during the summer. My view is that qualified immunity, that the police probably, as given the nature of their role, probably merit some limited immunity to civil action. But the immunity they currently enjoy is far too excessive. And I do think it contributes to police misconduct, the assumption being that if I mess up, I'm not going to be held accountable to the degree that were I a private citizen messing up in the same way I would be. So I think reducing qualified immunity is an important objective of the policing reform movement.
John and Jay, thoughts? Well, I will follow that up with the recent disclosures in the Breonna Taylor case and the release of the grand jury information. Do we revisit that immunity for prosecutors as well?
My answer is I don't know. I haven't
That's
thought
fair.
of that. That's an interesting question. I haven't thought about it.
That's fair.
And with that,
Thank you.
Kenya, John, Jay, Christine, and others, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed the discussion, and I have to go to another meeting. Carry on.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. We appreciate you joining us.
And I would say that there have been frequent instances of prosecutors that get away with way too much under that doctrine of qualified immunity. Gross misconduct that results in people being, put away for years and years. And so I think that's definitely something to look at.
Okay. Thank you. Jay?
Yeah. I like the point that there will always be distrust as long as there's no accountability in the criminal legal system. And that works for everybody. Like, thanks for saying that, Mel Smith. That works for everybody, right? The prosecutors, there's no accountability. Everyone who functions within that criminal legal system, the police, like they're not held accountable for any sort of misconduct. And the whole system allows them to do whatever they want. I think that is something to revisit.
So now I'm also going to look at it from the other side of the spectrum. If there are no safeguards in place, do we run the risk of opening the doors then back to frivolous lawsuits if people feel like they've not been treated properly or treated fairly? Do we see that it can ever be placed as a governor, or do we think that it's a situation that it's just there and it needs to be tossed out altogether?
I definitely think it needs to be passed out altogether. I think that in its design, it's working for its function of it's working as police is first designed, right? As slaveholders, it's working for the same function of allowing folks to get off doing whatever they want. I think that it needs to be completely. I'm about abolishing everything. It needs to be completely abolished. But also, like, I think that the beautiful thing about abolition is not just this idea of like getting rid of buildings. It's about building. It's about creating this world we really envision, and like, yeah, the whole core of it is creating this world that we are safe and affirmed and liberated, feel our most liberated selves. Yeah.
Now, in Kansas City, social workers have been added to staff, like policing staff. Do you think that's an effective intervention?
I would want to see the stats on everything. I'm not sure of the statistics, but I don't think it's effective to add anything to police departments. I don't think that it's effective to have folks with, I think that they don't need to be a part of police departments. Like, what is the point of putting a social worker with somebody who's trained to use force and has a gun? Like, I think that you could just send a social worker in there. So I would like to see that done outside of the police department. I think it's giving the already inflated police budget more money. Yeah.
And I'd agree with Jay on that one. I think the danger is that the social workers get captured by the mission of policing rather than the other way around. And that, the efficacy that they might have gets lost when they're, if the mission gets subverted by the police mission. I've always said I don't want my social workers carrying guns. And, that the point of saying that is, first of all, that police are not social workers, and we give them that mission a lot of times. We give them way too much to do. But also, essentially, if you have a team that's social workers with guns, is that really the best way to approach situations? Level of trust that a social worker might be able to establish disappears, when that gun is there backing them up. And their ability to function as social workers is greatly compromised. So I would go with Jay that I tend to think that the social workers need to act independently, and that we're actually taking things off the police plate completely.
Okay, thank you. Before I go to my next question, do we have guests that have questions? So Emil Smith says, slave patrols, I agree with Jay. The entire system has to be torn down and rebuilt. Its foundation is rotten, so the outgrowths are as well.
Yeah, and can I just add a little bit to that history? Because there is a lot, I think that public education has happened about slave patrols, and it's absolutely crucial to understanding the roots of our policing system. But the other half of the equation doesn't get mentioned as much, and that is Robert Peel, who was in London in 1839, established the first Metropolitan Police Department, and he's kind of the father of modern policing. And he had just come from suppressing rebellions in Ireland, and was given the task of suppressing labor revolts that were happening in Northern England. And so along with the tradition of slave patrols, there is also a long tradition of national and labor workers suppression that police have been a part of. And so there is a toxic cocktail of race and class and nationality that all play into the oppressive nature of policing. And all three of them I don't know, I don't want to say they're equally important, but they all play into, how policing plays out in America.
So you have an opportunity with unlimited funding. This is the part that I like the most. You have the opportunity with unlimited funding to build your system from the ground up. What does it look like?
I mean, my immediate thought as a community organizer is to like get community in a room and ask folks like what they want to see manifested. But I think that it looks like to me, folks having a roof over their heads, everybody. I think that it looks like to me, folks having quality education. I think it looks like folks breathing in clean air. I think it looks like folks not having to worry about who if I call the police in this situation, will that increase risk of harm? I think that it feels like liberation. I think that it smells like sage, this world. I think that, yeah, it's something that requires like this deep imagining, which is beautiful.
Thank you, Jay. John.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful vision. I really do. And I think that's awesome. I do think that one of the practical things that could be in place is mediation services. So it's part of the Ferguson consent decree that the Community Mediation Service, which is an organization in St. Louis, they're going to be mediating between citizens and police to resolve problems. But what's exciting to me is their other function to mediate between citizens who are having disputes, neighbors arguing over a fence or whatever, or loud noises or whatever, neighborhood disputes come up, with the specific goal of reducing the involvement of the criminal justice system. So I do think that we, need a system of elders, mediators, folks who are able to resolve conflicts as part of that vision. And that's something that's doable, now. And I think too, in the end, we have to be realistic about the need to develop a system for, what to do with the outlier person who just, is a threat, a physical threat to his or her neighbors. And that's the toughest one to figure out. I lived for several years in a spiritual community in Tennessee where we did not have a police force. We did have what we called our stout monks, who would on occasion have to escort people off the premises if the mediation and the de-escalation, et cetera, just didn't work. Now we had the advantage of having specific boundaries, and we could escort people. We weren't just passing a problem on to another community, because we were bounded. And so that's, again, only a partial solution, and that's part of the imagining that I don't think we've done fully yet.
And I think you bring up a good point. I want to address Janet Booth real quickly. And Janet says, there are many good policemen out there, people who entered as a form of service to protect and serve. And I don't want this conversation to stray away from acknowledging that those officers do exist, those people do exist.
And I couldn't agree more with that. Heather Taylor just resigned from St. Louis Police and was a model for a lot of us, I think, of, that there are good, well-intentioned police officers. What I usually like to say is that the mission of the police department is really twofold. And one of them is to protect and serve. Those are the folks who, ran into the buildings at 9/11 to rescue folks when everybody else was running away. And that's true. That's a reality. And I do think that most police officers go into the job with that goal in mind. What's often hidden from them and from the community at large is this second role of policing, which is to serve as a protector of the status quo, and often serves to repress, folks for racial and class reasons. And the well-meaning, the laws that the officers have to enforce are laws that were written largely by a fairly elite legislative group with particular class interests and racial interests in mind. And so I think that those good, well-meaning officers who come in to protect and serve do that, but they also fall victim to this other, less well-known, less acknowledged role that policing plays in our society.
Jay, would you
Yeah.
like a, I was just getting ready to come to you. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, and I think that
Hi.
it's possible there are good police
Hi.
officers out there, and
Yeah, we can.
the whole system is corrupt. So it's hard to like have something good come into this like really, really corrupt system that operates kind of as John said to promote this racist capitalist laws and system. So I think that the whole system is rotten. Even being a part of a rotten system creates rotten laws and policies and actions.
So I'm going to throw out another general question. How do we encourage people to go into that system as change agents? Or do we?
I think that there's a lot of things that you can do as a change agent that aren't a part of policing systems. So I definitely don't encourage folks to go into policing as if when they want to be a change agent. I say like think about community organizing. Think about like why do you want to be a change agent? What communities do you want to have an impact on? And like, what do those communities need? Are my first primary questions to ask folks who want to do that.
Okay. John, you want to touch base on that?
Yeah, I have to admit to being of mixed minds on this one. I don't think I would encourage anyone to go into policing either. But it's also true that, we need to work from the inside and the outside. Change often happens that way. So there are folks who are motivated to go inside. I wouldn't encourage them, but if they're motivated to work from the inside, I would just say, watch your back, be careful, do what you can not to get corrupted by the system along the way. I've had so many officers come to me who are reform-minded officers and tell me stories about how, and this is almost universal. They're told, the next time you have a call for backup, we're not going to have your back. When you read the Ethical Society of Police reports on disparate discipline within the department, disparate promotional practices, disparate transfer practices, that inside path is a tough one to stick with and execute. So, but if that's how folks are motivated, I think there is work to be done from the inside. I get a lot of valuable insights about what's going on in policing from those folks and appreciate a lot of what they do. So I guess to each his own, and we all need to work together.
Okay, thank you. While we're working through this process of police reform and reimagining what community safety looks like, there's still room to engage the community at some level. Now, John, you were talking about things like mediation and things like that. And Jay, I thought I saw a little bit of head nodding there that maybe, do you think maybe that the community can actually engage itself and do and take over some of those roles and work effectively as a partner with what we have now and do some of that mediation or, to help, to help move those situations? Can that actually be built as as a program, as a, as a community-based program?
Definitely. Yeah, and it's about getting to know your neighbors, getting to know folks in your community. So when you have an issue with your neighbor, you're not calling the police on them. You're like taking that and addressing it with them. And it's like very simple. It's conversation. It's building relationships. It's having accountability, self-accountability, and like community accountability. I think that can definitely be built in and should be, like we should already be, having those vulnerable conversations with folks in our communities and doing conflict mediation and like thinking about it on a wider scale.
Okay. John, thoughts?
Yeah, so the community mediation service basically works on that model. They have, community volunteers who are then trained in how to carry out mediations and serve in that role. So it really is a grassroots kind of ground up approach to how that's accomplished. And Jay talked earlier about the mutual aid functions that have popped up during COVID that I think are really great models for that kind of action. I have learned a bunch from Malcolm X grassroots movement, which has done a lot of that work in their communities, taking back blocks, and I mean taking back, from the police and having basically, community folks function to make that block successful. And they've had to deal with, the drug dealer on the corner, the loud neighbor, a lot of the problems that happen in community. And as Jay said, Black communities for decades have not been calling the police and have learned how to, function through mutual aid type approaches. So I think that there's a lot more that could be done, but there's a lot of good role models out there for how to do it.
Thank you. Josephine says, I dare say that there are not many young boys who did not pick policing as one of their roles. Some of those boys grew up to be good policemen and should not be discouraged. Thank you. John, you touched on this a little earlier, and it does call back to question because I don't think Jay actually got an opportunity to speak to this. There's never going to be a utopian society. Wherever you have people, there's going to be people who aggress or people who, for whatever reason, we're going to have some level of, as we denoted, crime in society. If under one plan we just abolish and throw everything out, what do we do with people, who are those outliers, who are an inherent danger to those around us and to people who, in society? How do we handle the people like that under that particular system?
That's a great question. And I think that we're all still trying to figure that out. And I think that it's not just abolish, and that's defunding isn't just like take all the money away, there's no police, right? Defunding the police it's a step towards abolition, yes, but it's like, where right now can we take these funds out and put them into community needs, right? Where in this $208 million budget that has zero amount to homelessness, like where can we strip some funds and house some folks? Where can we, right? Like it's not this like, let's just, because we don't have the infrastructure to do that right now. So acknowledging that, and also like, just like, where can we strip and actually reduce and prevent, get to real root of crime and prevent things. And I think that in some areas, like what I shared with the group about pod mapping, comes from the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, and I love models of transformative justice that really seek to hold individuals who have committed harm accountable and go through processes that actually transform those individuals. That, yeah, we don't have that infrastructure in place yet.
And I think you said something super important, and in a sense, I'm glad you went there, is because I think that there is an understanding about on many that, you know, defunding means tomorrow that there's not going to be any police department. If you call 911, the phone is going to ring, the houses are going to burn down, you know, and that's what we're going to look at in the next year. And what is being discussed is a reallocation of funds into services where officers may wear a lot of hats and would free them up to perform other services and let firefighters, social workers, medical personnel, and those people actually take on more of their charges. Mm-hmm. And that's the discussion that, you know, we're hearing, so that there's a better understanding of what does this look like in different narratives. Now, there are some other narratives that are like, yeah, throw the baby out with the bathwater now and now, but what is the majority of the discussion is around the reallocation of these funds and what that actually looks like.
And I think there's a continuum of, you know, where people fall on those lines. So some people would be happy to do some of those reforms, get rid of a few ineffective programs and stop there. And other folks think we can go much further towards, you know, actual abolition. But, you know, and it comes down in the end to that question of, you know, those outlier people, but we don't know at this point how many of those outliers there are and what they would look like or what our services would look like. So, you know, if we had adequate mental health care in this country, if we had equal education and a decent educational system in this country, if we had, you know, affordable housing, how many people would be constructive members of society who aren't now? You know, we don't quite know the answer. But I think that as we move in that direction, we'll start to see that there are fewer and fewer of those outliers. We don't know quite where, you know, that'll stop. You know, I grew up with this movie, I don't know if most of you have seen it, called The Bad Seed. That was about this little girl who was just evil at heart, you know. I don't tend to believe that there are very many people who are evil, you know, at their core, who haven't been made the way they are by mistakes that we've all made in their upbringing. Maybe there are a few and we'd have to deal with that, but I have a hunch that it's a much smaller number than, you know, what the folks who are fearful, you know, kind of imagine in their minds. So those are, you know, we can't cross every bridge at once. We need to just keep pushing down that road and see how far we get and deal with problems as they come up.
Agreed, because as it stands right now, we have 1 in 38 people are under some form of correctional control in the United States. That's a lot of people. That includes those people who are on probation, parole, incarcerated, diversion, any form of correctional control. We have 1 in 38 people. We have some comments, and I want to get to those. Mel says, really needs to be demilitarized, like Mr. Chasnoff spoke earlier. The Pentagon sells older equipment to police so they can buy new weapons. This keeps the military budget growing. Elise, Max, and Lauren, I'm sorry that did not, Sobak, says, how can we incentivize police to stand up against bad police? Is that even possible when the disparities are systemic? When do good folks open their eyes and decide to take part in I'm sorry, I lost that one. Decide to take part in a bad system. Patty says, we've gotten used to throwing people away. It's this thinking that needs to be changed. We need resources and new ways to handle society's ill. The proof is there that what we're doing does not work. Jamo says, amen, John. Affordable housing produces so many positive outcomes. There was a presentation about this by the Casey Public Health Department at our annual conference a few years back. And Markuya, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Watson spelled this out clearly on yesterday's Empowering You webinar. Patty says, I know I'm singing to the choir, but I believe we make it much harder than needed. But educating the public about the realities of some people's lives. Josephine says, one of the things that has the public against the defund idea is the choice of the word, which people have taken literally. Wish there was some way we could go back and come up with a term which really explains the intent. You know, I'd like to hang there for a moment. How do we speak about language around what reform looks like, around what the defunding looks like? It's how again, we're back to that. How do we talk to people about, you know, what this is that's being proposed? What do these reforms look like? What are the legislative aspects? And have those conversations without setting off triggers and red flags. And we go back to 911's not going to answer, the houses are going to go burn down. How do we go back to those conversations? Media was one way. Jay?
Yeah, I think media, I think education around what organizers mean, local organizers, folks nationally, when they have this idea around defunding the police, like education around what we are saying, which, as you were speaking to earlier, is not like there's nothing there right now and everything's ablaze, right? It's the same thing as this divestment investment, divesting from these carceral models that are inherently racist and classist, and investing into community needs. It's just defunding is the same thing as divestment from, I think, political public education around what we mean by defunding. Yeah.
And in the earlier days of when Capcards was doing a campaign, we called it Re-envisioning Public Safety, which was really the same idea, which was that the police are not really keeping us safe, and we need to imagine a different way of thinking about public safety and divest money from the police to invest in communities. The defund phrase came along, and frankly, there was a lot of discussion among activists that I heard these discussions. Was that a good term? That it freaks people out? Maybe we need to pick some more gentle terms. But I think there's room for all of the terms. Close the workhouse freaked people out. Defund freaks people out. But I don't want to write that off as necessarily a bad thing. It has caused a backlash. But at the same time, it sparked conversation, and people say, defund the police, that's not possible. And somebody can say, well, maybe it is, maybe think of it this way. So it sparks conversation. It moves us along that path that I was saying, moving us closer to our dreams and keeping, ultimate goals and dreams in the forefront as, keep your eye on the prize type approach. So I'm not opposed to the defunding message just because it's polarizing necessarily.
Jay, would you like the last word?
Yeah, I think that just because it's polarizing, I think that, Black Lives Matter was radical at one point, right? Like, people were all up in arms with people saying Black Lives Matter. And really, it's just the affirmation that we should exist, we should breathe, we should live. And that was once radical. And so now defund the police is like this taboo to radical notion that really it's the same thing. It's an affirmation that Black folks should exist and breathe. And it's a reframing of the words, but it's the same affirmation that is rooted in this Black Lives Matter, that's rooted in this desire for for Black folks to live in a world where the police aren't killing us.
Thank you. So ultimately, police reform can take on, many different faces, shapes. I hope that this brings a clarity of what defunding means. And I appreciate Empower for allowing me to host this forum and moderate this forum. I'd like to thank the panelists. Thanks to John Chasnoff, and thank you, Jay, and of course, Rick, who had to leave earlier. I'm going to turn this back over to Christine Whitty. I hope everyone stays safe and be well. Christine?
Thank you, Kenya. And thank you all to our panelists. I really appreciate you taking your time to be with us this afternoon. I will send a follow-up email to everyone who registered for this call that will include a link to an evaluation, the recording of this, as well as some information about getting CEUs if you need it. And I also want to make an announcement that our November forum is going to be a little different. It's going to be in place of our annual conference that Empower Missouri holds every year and has held every year for over 100 years. We're bringing it virtual. I put a link to it online. It is going to be free because we've had some wonderful sponsors. We will be having Starsky Wilson as the keynote address during that event. He was the head of the Deaconess Foundation here in St. Louis and is heading over to take charge of the Children's Defense Fund. So that will be in place of our forum and in place of our annual conference. So that will be on November 20th. So feel free to look at that link. You can find it on our website at empowermissouri.org, where you can register and join us for that event in November. And then we'll be back here in December on the third Friday to kind of wrap up our forum series of re-envisioning public safety. So look for that information on our website as well. I will also include this in the email that I send out next week. But thank you all so much for being here this afternoon. And I look forward to talking with you at our next event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, John. I
Appreciate being
appreciate
here.
it. Thank you, Kenya. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very good job.
Thanks.
Thank
Justine.
you. I got nervous for a minute. It got really quiet. Thanks, Santi, for coming.
You
Bye,
did a great job.
Kiera.
Yeah, great job.
Thank
Hi,
you.
Janet.
Okay.
All right. Have a good weekend, Kenya.
Bye, y'all. Have a good weekend. Talk soon.
Bye. Great job.
Thanks.